When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, few Americans imagined that within a few years, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers would be living quietly within their borders. Yet by 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were being held in over 500 camps spread across nearly every state. They worked on farms, in sawmills, and food processing plants, guarded but rarely mistreated. Their presence created one of the war's strangest human paradoxes. The enemy was no longer a distant, faceless force in Europe. He was now in America, behind barbed wire, but living among civilians. The transfer of German prisoners began in 1943 as Allied forces advanced across North Africa. Captured members of the Afrika Korps, battle-hardened men under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, were shipped across the Atlantic. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment for all prisoners, and the United States largely adhered to it. Each man was fed, clothed, and housed to standards that astonished many Germans, accustomed to wartime scarcity. Many American officers reasoned that good treatment would encourage compliance and protect captured American soldiers in Axis hands. By late 1944, camps dotted the heartland of America, from Camp Swift in Texas to Camp Butner in North Carolina, and countless smaller branch camps scattered across rural towns. For many communities, it was their first direct contact with anyone German. The prisoners built roads, harvested crops, and repaired machinery. In return, they were paid a token wage in canteen credits, which could be spent on cigarettes, stationery, or simple comforts within the camp. Daily life inside was regimented but not cruel. German officers held classes and lectures, orchestras performed, even sports tournaments took place. American guards, many of them young men awaiting deployment, often came to view the prisoners less as monsters and more as weary soldiers caught in the same vast machinery of war. Both sides recognized the invisible wall between duty and humanity. Then came Christmas. For many Americans, the war had already taken sons, brothers, and fathers. Yet the season's traditions, rooted in faith, charity, and goodwill, persisted even in wartime. Churches and local relief groups began organizing small gestures of kindness toward the prisoners. Boxes of cookies, fruit, or hand-knit scarves arrived at camp gates. Some families sent Christmas cards addressed simply to a German prisoner. In several camps, choirs of POWs were permitted to sing carols in both English and German, songs like Stille Nacht, familiar to both sides. To the prisoners, many of whom had been fed on years of propaganda portraying Americans as merciless and materialistic, this kindness was disorienting. It did not fit the image they had been taught. The shock of compassion offered by people whose own relatives were dying on European battlefields created deep reflection among many of the men. The U.S. Army's Office of the ETUAT Provost Marshal General monitored these interactions carefully. Reports noted that morale within the camps improved during the holidays. Fewer escape attempts were recorded. Tensions eased. The American approach was partly pragmatic. Happy prisoners caused fewer problems, but it also reflected a broader moral stance. The United States sought to show, through action rather than ideology, that its fight was not against a people, but against a regime. This policy stood in contrast to the brutal treatment of Allied POWs in Axis hands. News from Europe of forced marches, starvation, and summary executions filtered slowly to the public. Yet within America's borders, an extraordinary experiment in restraint was unfolding. By Christmas 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across Belgium, a quieter battle was taking place in the American heartland, the struggle to retain humanity in wartime. The same season that brought destruction overseas brought unexpected reconciliation at home. Some German prisoners wept openly as they received gifts or cards from American families. Others wrote letters to their captors' churches, thanking them for compassion they could not explain. What began as an act of policy had, in many places, become something more, an unspoken bridge between enemies. The presence of German prisoners on American soil was not simply a humanitarian measure. It was also a logistical and tactical solution to an enormous wartime problem. By 1943, Allied forces were capturing Axis soldiers at a rate that exceeded Europe's capacity to house them safely. North African prison facilities overflowed within months of the Tunisian campaign. Transporting these men to the United States, more than 4,000 miles across the Atlantic, was the only practical option. The same Liberty ships that carried munitions to the front lines returned loaded with captured soldiers, turning supply routes into two-way lifelines. Once in America, the prisoners became a vital part of the home front labor network. With over 16 million American men in uniform, farms and factories suffered crippling manpower shortages. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be assigned non-military labor. The War Department seized this opportunity. POWs picked cotton in Texas, harvested corn in Iowa, and felled timber in Oregon. Their work directly supported wartime production, freeing American civilians for other critical tasks. From a security standpoint, the system worked remarkably well. The Atlantic crossing was perilous, but only a handful of ships carrying POWs were ever attacked. Inside the U.S., escape attempts were rare and typically unsuccessful. Military intelligence even used the camps to quietly assess German morale and ideology, monitoring attitudes toward Hitler as the war turned against Germany. Thus, what appeared to be a simple act of containment doubled as a study in psychological warfare and operational efficiency, a tactical success shaped by both necessity and foresight. Inside the camps, the human experience of captivity became a study in identity and adaptation. Most of the German soldiers were young, many under 25, drawn from the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, or Afrika Korps. They had fought for years under an ideology that promised victory and supremacy. To suddenly find themselves in the heart of their enemy's homeland, treated with fairness and even with sympathy, created a quiet, psychological rupture. The camps mirrored a small society. Prisoners formed choirs, built theaters, painted murals, and published handwritten newspapers. Education programs were introduced, some run by sympathetic guards, others by the prisoners themselves. Former teachers and engineers held lectures on history, mathematics, or philosophy. This environment allowed many POWs to rediscover parts of themselves that war had buried. A number later credited their time in American camps with reshaping their view of democracy and the individual's worth. The Christmas of 1944 revealed the emotional impact of this transformation. Simple gifts, an apple, a pair of gloves, a letter, touched something profound in men who had lost everything. Many wept not from joy but from confusion and shame. They could not understand why their enemy would show kindness while their own nation demanded ruthless loyalty. Psychologists and chaplains attached to the camps noted this moral dissonance. Acts of compassion, they reported, weakened ideological rigidity more effectively than interrogation. For some prisoners, that moment of generosity marked the beginning of an inner reckoning, a slow separation from Nazi indoctrination, replaced by a reluctant respect for those they once sought to destroy. The war continued abroad, but within the barbed wire, humanity quietly reasserted itself. At the command level, the treatment of Axis prisoners was a deliberate policy, born not of sentimentality, but of strategic leadership and legal obligation. The U.S. Army, guided by the War Department's Prisoner of War Division, sought to model conduct consistent with the Geneva Convention of 1929. The message was clear. America would fight fiercely in combat, but with discipline in captivity. General Brehon B. Somerville, head of the Army Service Forces, oversaw logistical coordination, ensuring that camps were built efficiently, supplies maintained, and the chain of command respected. Inspections were frequent, Abuse was discouraged. When incidents of mistreatment did occur, they were documented and punished. This insistence on order and legality contrasted sharply with the chaotic brutality of Axis prison systems. Leadership within the camps also extended to the German side. The Wehrmacht maintained its hierarchy, with officers separated from enlisted men. Within this structure, German officers often tried to preserve discipline and ideology, holding morning roll calls and enforcing adherence to military decorum. Some remained committed to National Socialism until the end. Others grew quietly disillusioned. American officers recognized this internal division and used it subtly. Re-education programs began in 1944 under the Special Projects Division, offering lectures, newsreels, and reading materials promoting democratic values. While not overt propaganda, it was a calculated effort to expose German soldiers to an alternative worldview. The humane treatment, particularly during the holidays, was part of this broader command strategy. To win moral authority, not just military victory, by combining discipline, legality, and controlled compassion, American leadership demonstrated that strength in war did not require cruelty, and that moral conduct could itself be a form of power. The moral implications of America's treatment of German POWs extended far beyond the camps. At a time when Europe was engulfed in atrocity, the U.S. approach offered a different narrative, that even in total war, restraint could serve strategy. Each Christmas parcel, each carol sung, was a quiet assertion that democracy's strength lay in its humanity. This policy had measurable consequences. Reports sent to the War Department indicated that German soldiers in Europe, aware of their comrades' treatment in American custody, were more willing to surrender. By late 1944, surrender rates in the Western Front rose noticeably compared to the Eastern Front, where fear of Soviet retribution drove many Germans to fight to the death. In this sense, kindness became a weapon of influence, undermining enemy morale while upholding American ideals. Yet the policy was not without controversy. Some families of fallen American soldiers viewed the prisoners' comfortable conditions with resentment. Newspapers occasionally published letters demanding harsher treatment, arguing that compassion toward the enemy dishonored the dead. Still, Washington held firm. Officials believed that moral consistency would matter not just in victory, but in the post-war world that would follow. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, this foresight proved justified. Many former POWs returned home with stories of fairness and decency that contrasted sharply with their experience under the Nazi regime. In the coming decades, these memories would shape West Germany's perception of the United States, not as an occupier, but as a moral authority. In that sense, the Christmas gifts of 1944 were more than gestures of goodwill. They were the foundation of reconciliation. By December 1944, America was fighting its third Christmas of war. On the European front, Allied armies had broken through France, but were now being tested in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive, was raging in the snow-covered forests of Belgium. Thousands of Americans were dying under German fire. Yet, at the same moment, thousands of German soldiers, captured months or years earlier, were living behind barbed wire in the quiet landscapes of the United States. The contrast could not have been sharper. In the Midwest, cotton fields and orchards had given way to frozen fields. Camp fences were strung with a few strands of tinsel, placed by guards or chaplains trying to bring a trace of normalcy. Inside, many German prisoners had constructed makeshift Christmas trees from branches gathered during work details. They hung ornaments made of paper, tin foil, or empty ration tins. Choirs rehearsed carols in both languages. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, Camp Algona in Iowa, and Camp Crossville in Tennessee, American officers permitted evening concerts. Local townspeople, curious and cautious, gathered outside the wire to listen as the voices of their enemies carried through the winter air. Silent Night, Stille Nacht, was sung softly, the words identical in both languages. For a moment, War seemed far away. Then came the unexpected. Parcels began to arrive from the local communities. Church groups, the Red Cross, and sometimes individual families sent small Christmas packages addressed simply to a German POW. They contained apples, oranges, chocolate, hand-knit gloves, cigarettes, or even small Bibles. For many prisoners, it was the first gesture of humanity they had received since their capture. At Camp Mexia, Texas, records note that a local Sunday school sent several boxes of cookies and handmade cards. One guard later recalled seeing hardened Afrika Korps and veterans weeping quietly as they opened the gifts. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the prisoners were invited to attend a Christmas service led by an American chaplain. The sermon, delivered in English and translated by a German interpreter, spoke of peace and forgiveness. Several prisoners reportedly bowed their heads and prayed, not as Germans or Americans, but as men longing for home. For U.S. authorities, this generosity was not orchestrated from above. It grew from below, out of the instincts of ordinary Americans who chose to see humanity even in the uniform of the enemy. Many of them had sons overseas. Some had lost them. Yet, in an era when vengeance could easily have prevailed, empathy persisted. The effect on the prisoners was profound. Some later described that Christmas as the first time they questioned what they had been fighting for. Letters recovered from camp archives reveal their confusion and gratitude. "Why do these people treat us so well?" wrote one prisoner. "We were told they were devils, but they act like Christians." Another wrote, "I will never forget that an American mother sent me a gift while my own country burned." The psychological barrier between captor and captive had cracked, not through propaganda or negotiation, but through something far quieter and far stronger. In the weeks that followed that Christmas, something intangible changed inside many American prisoner-of-war camps. The fences were still there, the sentries still patrolled, and the war continued across oceans, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as an act of seasonal kindness was turning into a quiet redefinition of enmity itself. At Camp Algona, the prisoners had constructed a small nativity scene entirely from found materials: wood scraps, clay, and colored paper. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. American officers allowed it to remain on display after Christmas, and local families were invited to see it. Visitors came in groups, walking through the snow to view what newspapers later called the work of the enemy's hands. The display, rather than inflaming resentment, stirred admiration. It revealed the prisoners not as faceless soldiers, but as artisans, fathers, and sons. Throughout early 1945, this pattern repeated across the country. German POW orchestras performed benefit concerts for local war charities. Prisoners donated portions of their small camp wages to the Red Cross. In several places, communities reciprocated with further gestures of goodwill, extra rations, music exchanges, or shared religious services, but it was not sentimentality. The war's brutality remained undeniable. Many Americans had lost loved ones in Europe and could not bring themselves to forgive. Yet within the camps, something resembling mutual recognition emerged, a fragile understanding that beneath ideology lay a shared human exhaustion. American officers observed these developments closely. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office described a visible decline in Nazi loyalty among the prisoners. Camp informants noted that after Christmas 1944, more men openly criticized Hitler and the war's purpose. A German sergeant at Camp McCain, Mississippi, was quoted telling his peers, "The Americans have defeated us not with their weapons, but with their decency." The realization spread quietly. Prisoners who had once resisted re-education efforts now attended lectures voluntarily. Religious services drew larger congregations. Some men began studying English, hoping to maintain contact with Americans after the war. These subtle shifts reflected a deeper transformation. The collapse of ideological certainty under the weight of human empathy. Meanwhile, letters from these camps began reaching Germany through the Red Cross. Many were censored, but fragments slipped through. Accounts of kind treatment, of Christmas gifts, of guards who spoke politely and shared cigarettes. For families enduring bombings and deprivation, such stories seemed almost unbelievable. But they carried an unintended consequence. They exposed the moral contrast between life in a democracy and life under the Third Reich. Historians later observed that this soft, humane front inside the United States achieved what military confrontation could not. It demonstrated, in real time, the principles the Allies claimed to defend. The contrast between the chaos in Europe and the civility of these American camps became, for many prisoners, the moment when defeat turned into reflection. By the spring of 1945, when news of Hitler's death reached the camps, few cheered and few mourned. Most remained silent. They had already undergone their reckoning months earlier, during a Christmas defined not by ideology, but by conscience. It was in those quiet moments, when an American family's parcel crossed the wire, when a German soldier bowed his head over a foreign Bible, that the war's moral center briefly steadied, not in victory parades or battlefields, but in the fragile grace between enemies who had finally seen each other as men. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war in Europe ended, but the story of its prisoners in America did not. For the hundreds of thousands of German POWs held across the United States, life behind the wire entered a new, uncertain phase. They were now prisoners of peace, waiting not for release from battle, but for the slow machinery of repatriation to begin. The U.S. government, in cooperation with Britain, began transferring many of the prisoners back across the Atlantic during the second half of 1945. They were first sent to temporary labor camps in the United Kingdom or France before returning to the ruins of Germany. The process took time. By the end of 1946, the last major groups had departed American soil. For the Americans who had lived near the camps, their departure left a noticeable emptiness. In hundreds of small towns, relationships had quietly formed, built through labor, music, and the rare compassion of wartime coexistence. Farmers remembered the discipline and skill of their temporary workers. Pastors recalled joint services held under makeshift tents. For a generation raised on slogans of total victory, the experience had complicated the meaning of enemy. The legacy of that 1944 Christmas lingered in memory and in letters. Some German POWs wrote back to the American families who had sent them gifts, expressing gratitude long after returning home. A few correspondences continued for decades. One former prisoner from Camp Algona later wrote to a local pastor, "You showed us that a man's worth does not depend on his uniform. You defeated hatred in a way no army could." Not all reactions were gentle. Some American veterans resented the warmth shown to their captives, believing it dishonored the dead. Yet for others, the treatment of the prisoners became a source of quiet national pride. Proof that even in total war, the United States had held to its principles. From a military standpoint, the POW system had been remarkably efficient. The men had contributed millions of hours of labor to the wartime economy, easing shortages without incident. From a humanitarian standpoint, it was one of the largest and most successful prisoner management efforts in modern warfare. The Geneva Convention had been tested on an unprecedented scale, and, for the most part, it had held. But the moral consequence went further. When the Federal Republic of Germany was established in 1949, many of its early leaders and educators had once been POWs in Allied custody. Some had been held in the United States and carried back with them an enduring impression of democracy practiced through fairness, not force. They became voices of moderation in the rebuilding of West Germany, a quiet legacy. Of the war's most humane chapter, historians have noted that this form of moral diplomacy helped lay groundwork for post-war reconciliation. American kindness, expressed through small acts of decency rather than treaties, became an early signal of what post-war relations could look like. It softened the ground on which a devastated nation would later build alliance instead of enmity. By 1947, most of the American camps were dismantled. Their barracks returned to farmland, schools, or local fairgrounds. Only a few traces remained: weathered concrete foundations, photographs in county archives, or a handful of handmade artifacts preserved in museums. Among the most moving of these relics is the Algona nativity scene, restored and displayed in Iowa to this day. Built by prisoners who once sang Silent Night behind wire, it now stands freely, visited each Christmas by Americans and Germans alike. What endures from those years is less a story of imprisonment than of awakening, a moment when the sharp lines of war blurred long enough for humanity to show through. The soldiers returned home changed. The guards, too, remembered, and the country that had once feared the arrival of its enemies learned that even in conflict, mercy could serve a strategic purpose and, perhaps, something higher. In the long arc of the Second World War, the story of German prisoners in America may seem small beside the scale of battles and destruction that defined the era. Yet, in its quiet way, it revealed something essential about the war's moral landscape: that the measure of civilization is not taken in victory, but in conduct. The men who crossed the Atlantic in chains found a country unlike the one they had been taught to hate. They expected punishment and found discipline. They expected cruelty and found order. They expected vengeance and encountered kindness. Within that reversal lay one of the war's most subtle triumphs: the triumph of principle over passion. For the Americans who lived through those years, the presence of enemy soldiers in their own towns became a test of conscience. Every loaf of bread shared, every Christmas gift passed through a wire fence, was an assertion that values mattered, even when survival was at stake. In the winter of 1944, as Europe froze under the collapse of empires, America proved something profound. That restraint could be as powerful as force. When those German soldiers went home, they carried with them memories of that contradiction, the realization that their captors had shown them a humanity their own leaders had abandoned. Many later said it was in those American camps that they first understood democracy not as a system, but as a spirit, a belief that even one's enemy retains dignity. History rarely records compassion as an act of strategy, yet here it was precisely that. The kindness shown to prisoners hastened surrender, softened hearts, and built bridges that would one day hold up a peaceful Europe. What began as policy became legacy. Today, the story endures not in speeches or monuments, but in the small details left behind: a letter of thanks, a handmade nativity, a fading photograph of a German choir singing Silent Night in an American field. These fragments remind us that even amid the vast machinery of war, humanity can still find its voice. The war ended, but the memory of that Christmas, when enemies wept over gifts from strangers, remains one of its quietest and most enduring victories.